The early years of the 14th century opened under a shadow. Across Europe, a catastrophe unfolded that left no kingdom untouched. For 3 long years, beginning in 1315, rains poured without end, drowning crops before they could ripen, flooding villages, and turning fertile fields into swamps. Grain rotted in storage, livestock starved, and men and women were left to scrape survival from whatever the earth could still offer. Families ground acorns into meal and boiled roots that barely staved off hunger. The Great Famine swept across the continent like an invisible army, sparing no region, taking millions of lives, and weakening those who survived. When the skies finally cleared, Europe's soil was exhausted and its people diminished. Villages stood empty, their names fading from memory, while cities reeled from shortages and unrest. This disaster struck at the very foundations of medieval life. Agriculture was the heart of the economy, and when it faltered, so too did the social order. Nobles who relied on rents saw their incomes dwindle. Kings who taxed those incomes to fund their courts and armies found their treasuries hollow. The people, worn down by hunger and disease, carried within them a quiet bitterness that would linger long after the famine had passed. The fabric of Christendom had begun to fray, and as the famine receded, it left behind a Europe less secure, less trusting, and more vulnerable to storms of another kind. Even as fields lay bare, the Church, once the unshakable guide of Christian Europe, entered its own season of uncertainty. In 1309, the papacy abandoned Rome and settled in Avignon, a city on the Rhone River under heavy French influence. To many, this was nothing short of betrayal. Rome, the eternal city, had been the seat of St. Peter and the symbol of the Church's universality. Now the popes appeared as clients of the French crown. Pilgrims and preachers alike whispered that the papacy had lost its independence, that the successor of St. Peter was little more than a courtier of the Capetians. Heavy taxes imposed from Avignon further embittered kingdoms such as England, where resentment of papal interference had deep roots. Though the Church still commanded vast authority, the aura of unity it once held began to dim, replaced by murmurs of corruption and decline. If the spiritual world was shaken, so too was the political one. In France, the mighty Capetian dynasty had ruled without interruption for more than 3 centuries, building one of the strongest monarchies in Europe. But fate proved cruel. Philip V, called the Fair, died in 1314, leaving 3 sons to inherit in turn. Each ruled briefly, each died without leaving a surviving male heir. By 1328, with the death of Charles IV, the direct Capetian line was extinct. This sudden vacuum of succession would soon open the door to rival claims, including one from across the Channel, a claim that would ignite a conflict lasting more than a century. Against this troubled backdrop stood the Kingdom of England, itself mired in weakness under Edward II. His father, Edward I, had been a colossus among kings, a man of relentless energy who had conquered Wales, humbled Scotland, and imposed royal authority with an iron hand. Edward II inherited his throne in 1307, but not his father's resolve. Where the elder king had been austere and commanding, the son was indulgent and prone to favoritism. He loved music and pageantry, the company of a few chosen companions, and the pleasures of court life, but he lacked the discipline and foresight required of a monarch ruling restless barons and ambitious neighbors. His downfall began with his devotion to one man, Piers Gaveston. This Gascon knight, charming and flamboyant, became Edward's closest confidant. The king lavished him with titles, lands, and honors, provoking outrage among England's greatest nobles. To the mighty earls who traced their bloodlines back to the Norman conquest, Gaveston was an unworthy intruder, a parasite at the heart of the realm. Their anger boiled into open confrontation. Twice they forced Gaveston into exile, and when he returned, they took matters into their own hands, capturing and executing him. The king's grief was immense, but his reliance on favorites did not end. Soon the Despencer's father and son replaced Gaveston in the royal affection, and with them came new resentments. While the king quarreled with his barons, the realm's prestige collapsed on the battlefield. In 1314, Edward marched north to Scotland to confront Robert the Bruce. At Bannockburn, outside Stirling, the English army, once thought invincible, suffered a catastrophic defeat. The chivalric cavalry, the pride of the realm, found itself trapped in marshy ground, unable to maneuver, while Scottish infantry formed impenetrable walls of spears. English knights fell in droves, and the king himself barely escaped capture. The rout at Bannockburn reverberated across Europe. Scotland remained free, its independence secured for a generation, and Edward's authority was discredited beyond repair. In the years that followed, discontent grew sharper. The famine had already reduced England's population and wealth, and the loss of prestige only deepened frustration. Nobles muttered that their king was unfit to lead. Peasants bore heavier taxes with little protection in return. Even within his own household, Edward faced betrayal. His queen, Isabella of France, the daughter of Philip IV, grew estranged as the Despensers tightened their grip over her husband. Denied influence at court, humiliated by the presence of rivals, Isabella began to chart her own path, one that would soon shake the kingdom to its core. The picture of England in these years is one of slow unraveling. Power lay not with the crown, but with rival factions. Barons demanded ordinances that restricted the king's authority. Councils were convened at sword's point, with nobles pressing their demands upon a monarch too weak to resist. Local lords, sensing the vacuum, asserted their own rights, often at the expense of royal justice. The machinery of governance faltered, and disorder spread through shires and towns. For the common people, life was hard. The memory of famine remained fresh, wages were meager, and lawlessness often went unpunished. In this world, survival was uncertain and loyalty fragile. Yet within the hardship lay seeds of transformation. The cracks in the feudal order would, over time, give rise to new forms of resistance, new demands for accountability, and new voices in governance. Though the great peasant rising of 1381 lay decades in the future, the conditions for such unrest were already being prepared under Edward II. Contemporaries wrote of a king ill-suited to the crown, a man who preferred the company of his chosen companions to the burdens of kingship. Yet the truth was more complex. Edward II was not without courage or intelligence, but he lacked the capacity to balance the fierce ambitions of his nobility. He confused loyalty with personal affection, governance with indulgence, and in doing so alienated the very men upon whom his monarchy depended. A crown that should have been a source of unity became instead a focal point of discord. All the while, young Edward, the king's son and heir, grew up in this climate of uncertainty. Born in 1312, the boy watched as his father quarreled with lords, lost battles, and surrendered influence to courtiers. He saw his mother pushed aside, her dignity affronted, her resentment deepening. He lived in a kingdom weakened by hunger, divided by faction, and humiliated abroad. These impressions, carved deep into a child's memory, would shape the man he would become. Beyond England, the wider world continued its march toward crisis. In France, with the Capetian line extinguished, the throne passed to Philip VI of Valois, cousin of the last Capetians. Yet his claim was not unchallenged. Across the Channel, young Edward III, as the son of Isabella of France and grandson of Philip III, possessed his own claim, one that many would consider legitimate. Though the full consequences of this dispute were not yet clear, the seeds of a monumental conflict had been planted. In the halls of Westminster, tension simmered. The king sat on his throne, his crown slightly askew, while nobles muttered and cast dark glances. Outside, the rain continued to fall, turning roads into rivers of mud. Merchants complained of empty ports, farmers despaired of ruined harvests, and soldiers nursed the humiliation of Bannockburn. Across the Channel, the French court watched with interest, knowing that England's weakness could be their opportunity. In Avignon, the papacy taxed and decreed, but its authority no longer inspired awe. Europe was restless, weary, and ripe for upheaval. It was into this world that Edward III would rise. The boy who had watched his father falter and his mother plot would soon seize the crown for himself. He would learn from the failures he had seen, mold himself into the image of a warrior king, and seek to restore the honor that England had lost. But for now, in the years of Edward II, the kingdom drifted, adrift in famine's aftermath, burdened by defeat, and torn by rivalries that made even the strongest throne seem fragile. The famine had taught Europe how quickly prosperity could vanish. The Avignon papacy had shown how spiritual authority could be compromised. The Capetian crisis revealed that dynasties were not eternal, and Edward II's reign demonstrated how easily a kingdom could slide from order into disarray. These lessons would not be forgotten, least of all by the young heir who would one day turn England's fortunes. The storm clouds that gathered in these years did not disperse. They darkened, waiting for the moment when ambition, opportunity, and conflict would ignite. When that moment came, it would reshape the history of England and France alike. The dawn of the 100 Years' War was still years away, but already its outlines could be glimpsed in the hunger of the people, the weakness of kings, and the restless ambition of princes. Europe stood at the threshold of a new age, and the boy who would lead England into that age was watching, learning, and waiting. The story of Edward II's downfall cannot be told without Isabella of France. Born the daughter of Philip Thifter, she was raised in the glittering yet ruthless court of Paris, where political maneuvering was as natural as breathing. When she was married at the age of 12 to the English king, the union was meant to symbolize a bond between two powerful dynasties. In theory, Isabella would bridge the channel, softening tensions between Capetian France and Plantagenet England. In reality, her marriage became a wound that never healed. Edward was already a controversial figure, and his devotion to Piers Gaveston and later to the Despensers left little space for his queen. Isabella, intelligent and observant, found herself increasingly sidelined. Chronicles describe her as graceful, articulate, and politically shrewd, but at Edward's court, she was overshadowed by favorites who mocked her dignity and drained her influence. The tension between husband and wife was not merely personal, it was political. As daughter of France, Isabella expected to command respect, yet she was treated as an inconvenience. The humiliation deepened when the Despensers consolidated their hold over Edward. They confiscated lands that belonged to Isabella's household, reducing her status and stripping her of the income that a queen traditionally enjoyed. She was no longer simply ignored, she was undermined. Resentment grew quietly within her, smoldering as she watched her husband yield to advisors who cared little for the stability of the crown. The courtiers may have dismissed her, but Isabella was not a woman to remain passive. Opportunity arrived in the late 1320s, when Edward sent her to France as an envoy to negotiate with her brother, Charles I, over the disputed Duchy of Gascony. For the first time in years, she was free of the suffocating influence of the Despensers. In Paris, Isabella discovered more than diplomatic leverage. She discovered independence. She presented herself not as the neglected wife of an unpopular king, but as a French princess wronged by England. Sympathy poured in from her native court, and she began to craft a new identity, not Edward's consort, but a political force in her own right. It was in France that she encountered Roger Mortimer. Once a powerful baron in England, Mortimer had risen against the Despensers and paid for his defiance with imprisonment in the Tower of London. Yet he had escaped dramatically and fled to France, where he now lived in exile. Charismatic, daring, and driven by the desire for revenge, Mortimer became the unlikely partner Isabella needed. Their alliance was born not merely of shared grievance, but of shared ambition. She, the queen without power, and he, the lord without lands, found common cause in overthrowing Edward II and dismantling the regime of the Despensers. This partnership electrified European politics. To Edward's supporters, Isabella was a traitor, conspiring with his enemies. To his critics, she was a heroine who dared to challenge tyranny. In the courts of France and among exiled English nobles, whispers spread of a movement gathering strength, a storm that would soon sweep across the Channel. The chroniclers of the time, always eager for drama, painted Isabella in vivid colors. Some saw her as the tragic queen betrayed by her husband. Others would later call her the she-wolf of France. A woman too ambitious, too dangerous, too cunning to be confined by the roles expected of her. Whether wolf or heroine, Isabella's path was set. With Mortimer at her side and French resources at her disposal, she began to build a coalition that stretched from disaffected English lords to Flemish merchants eager to weaken Edward's rule. Her cause was framed not as rebellion but as justice, the removal of corrupt counselors and the restoration of good governance. Behind the rhetoric lay a deeper aim, the seizure of power itself. It is here that the story shifts from private grievance to public upheaval. The queen, who had been ignored in her husband's court, now prepared to return at the head of an armed host. The exile had become a leader, and her son, the young Edward of Windsor, would soon serve as the banner around which rebellion gathered. England stood on the brink of a transformation, and Isabella would be the hand that pushed it forward. History often pivots on moments when personal wounds become political weapons. Isabella's humiliation at Edward's court was no longer simply the sorrow of a neglected queen. It had become the rallying cry for barons and commons alike who longed for change. What began in the nursed private chambers of a fractured marriage was about to reshape the destiny of a kingdom. And as we trace this remarkable turning point, let us pause and reflect. If you've been drawn into Isabella's rise from sideline consort to a force capable of toppling a king, imagine what lies ahead. The story is only beginning, and the twists that follow will challenge everything England believed about monarchy, loyalty, and power. Stay with us, subscribe, and share this journey, because the tale of Edward II and Isabella is not just a fragment of medieval history. It is a saga of ambition, betrayal, and the making of a new era. In the autumn of 1326, Isabella and Roger Mortimer put their plans into motion. From the harbors of Flanders, ships were gathered, and with them came a small but determined army of mercenaries, exiles, and allies bound by shared resentment against the Despensers and Edward II. It was not a vast force in numbers, but it was sharpened by resolve and guided by the belief that England itself longed for change. Isabella carried with her not only soldiers but also her son, the young Edward of Windsor. At only 13 years old, he was to serve as the living banner of legitimacy, the embodiment of continuity for a realm weary of misrule. The fleet crossed the Channel in late September, landing in Suffolk. The choice was deliberate, a region where dissatisfaction with Edward II ran deep and where support could quickly be gathered. When Isabella's army marched inland, they did not encounter fierce resistance. Instead, local lords and towns opened their gates, welcoming her as a deliverer. Many of England's greatest barons, long alienated by the king's favoritism and cruelty of the Despensers, rushed to her side. The tide turned almost at once. Edward II, unprepared for such swift betrayal, struggled to rally forces. He had relied so completely on the loyalty of the Despensers that, when the realm turned against them, he found himself isolated. The king fled westward, seeking refuge in Wales, the land his father had once subdued, hoping that its castles might provide a stronghold. But fortune deserted him, allies melted away, and his authority dissolved with each passing day. The people no longer looked upon their monarch as protector. They saw in Isabella and her son the promise of renewal. The march of Isabella and Mortimer resembled less an invasion than a procession of triumph. From town to town, the banners of the Queen's party rose higher. Chroniclers noted the swiftness of the collapse, how scarcely a sword was raised in defense of Edward II. The Despensers, once so arrogant in their control, now became fugitives despised by all. Nobles who had been cowed for years found their courage restored, and common folk rejoiced at the prospect of change. By early November, London itself was in their hands. The city, ever sensitive to the winds of power, embraced Isabella. The capital's merchants and guilds, burdened by taxation and corruption, hailed the arrival of the Queen and her young son. Parliament was convened under her influence, and the pressure upon Edward II became irresistible. Deserted by his followers, he was forced to yield. The crown would not be his to wear any longer. In January 1327, the decision was formalized. Edward II was compelled to abdicate in favor of his son. The boy, not yet 14, was proclaimed Edward III, King of England. The ceremony was both solemn and symbolic. Though the child had no power of his own, he represented continuity, a future untainted by the failures of his father. To the assembled nobles and clergy, this was not only the end of a reign, but the beginning of restoration. Isabella and Mortimer now stood as the true rulers, guiding the new king while holding the realm in their grasp. To many, they appeared as saviors who had rescued England from tyranny. Yet within their triumph lay seeds of new tensions, for power won through upheaval is rarely secure. Still, in that moment of transition, England breathed more freely than it had in years. The long night of Edward II's rule was over, and the dawn of Edward III's reign had begun. The fall of Edward II was as swift as it was complete. Few kings of England had been so thoroughly abandoned by their people, and few had been replaced with such little resistance. The chronicles linger on the contrast, a king once crowned with promise, now displaced by his own wife and raised son. It was a reminder that monarchy in the 14th century rested not only on bloodline but on the fragile consent of lords, church, and commons. When that consent was broken, even a king anointed by God could be cast aside. Edward III was now king, but the crown rested lightly upon the head of a boy scarcely into his teenage years. In truth, power lay in the hands of his mother, Isabella, and her ally, Roger Mortimer. The two had risen as liberators, hailed as saviors who had cast down Edward II and broken the tyranny of the dispensers. Yet within months of their triumph, whispers began to circulate in the halls of Westminster and in the manors of the realm. The new rulers governed in the young king's name, but it was their will, not his, that guided the kingdom. At first, Isabella sought to portray her regency as a restoration of order. She presented herself as the faithful guardian of her son, the protector of the crown, until he reached maturity. Mortimer was cast as her chief advisor, a noble who had sacrificed for England and now stood ready to rebuild it. For a time, many accepted this image. After the chaos of Edward II's reign, stability seemed welcome. But power, once grasped, has a way of revealing true ambition. Mortimer in particular grew bold, rewarding himself with vast estates confiscated from his enemies and asserting authority with a confidence that rivaled any king. The great magnates of England, men who had thrown their weight behind Isabella's invasion, began to feel cheated. They had not risked rebellion merely to see one royal favorite replaced by another. When petitions for land and offices were denied, when Mortimer's hand appeared everywhere in governance, discontent simmered. The queen, once admired for her courage, now seemed increasingly under the sway of a single man. To critics, the regency looked less like a partnership and more like domination. The foreign stage added to the strain. Peace had to be made with Scotland, and in 1328 the Treaty of Northampton was signed. Its terms recognized Robert the Bruce as King of Scots and surrendered long-claimed English rights in the north. To Isabella and Mortimer, it was a practical necessity. England could not afford further war. To many nobles, it was a humiliation, a betrayal of the victories Edward I had won. Discontent grew sharper, and resentment toward the regents hardened. In the court, the young Edward III watched all with careful eyes. Though still a boy, he was not blind to the way his authority was overshadowed. When he appeared in public, he was treated with respect befitting a king, but every order bore the signature of others. He was paraded as a symbol, a reminder of legitimacy, while real decisions were made behind closed doors by his mother and Mortimer. To some, he appeared docile, pliant. Yet within the youth stirred a growing awareness of his own role and his own destiny. The regency soon revealed its darker side. Mortimer, fearing plots and rivals, moved ruthlessly against those who opposed him. Trials were arranged, lands were seized, and enemies silenced. The atmosphere of liberation that had accompanied Isabella's landing gave way to a climate of intimidation. Nobles whispered that a new tyranny had replaced the old. The very charge once leveled against the dispensers, that they manipulated a weak king for their own enrichment, was now spoken of Isabella and Mortimer. By 1329, their dominance was unchallenged in form, but not in spirit. Beneath the surface, opposition gathered strength. The boy king was nearing his 17th year, and with it came expectations of independence. The magnates who had once supported Isabella began to look upon Edward III as their hope, the vessel through which the realm might be restored. In him, they saw not merely youth, but the promise of a return to rightful kingship, free from the shadow of regents. The years between 1327 and 1330 thus stood as a paradox. England was governed more efficiently than under Edward II, yet dissatisfaction deepened. Isabella and Mortimer held power firmly, but their very grasp bred resentment. And at the center of it all stood Edward III, silent for the moment, but quietly gathering resolve. His time had not yet come, but the lessons he absorbed during these years, the danger of favorites, the fragility of noble loyalty, the weight of royal dignity, would shape him profoundly. Soon enough, the boy who wore a crown in name only would act to claim it in truth. By 1330, Edward III was no longer a boy. At 17, he stood tall and confident, already carrying the presence of a king, yet his authority remained a shadow behind the figures of Isabella and Mortimer. The realm knew his name, but his will was still silenced by others. For 3 years, he had watched as Mortimer grew bold, enriching himself, alienating the nobility, and ruling with a hand that bore no crown. Edward had endured it in silence, learning the art of patience, but patience was wearing thin, and the time had come to act. The moment arrived at Nottingham Castle in October. Mortimer and Isabella were holding court there, secure in their belief that the young king was still under their control. The fortress itself was considered impregnable, its gates and towers manned by loyal guards. Yet the strength of stone walls matters little when the will of those inside has begun to waver. Among the nobles close to Edward, whispers had turned to resolve. The regency must end, and the king must rule in truth. Edward confided in a small circle of trusted men, loyal knights and companions of his own age, men who had grown restless under Mortimer's dominance. They formed a plan both daring and simple to seize Mortimer in the very heart of his power. The Keep of Nottingham held a hidden passage, an old subterranean way known only to a few. With this secret as their advantage, Edward's companions prepared to strike. On the night chosen, the castle above was filled with the usual activity of a royal household. Servants moving by torchlight, courtiers murmuring in halls, guards pacing the battlements. Beneath, in silence, Edward's allies crept through the passage. They emerged within the fortress unseen and made their way to the queen's apartments, where Mortimer felt most secure. The young king was present, not as a passive onlooker, but as the leader of the enterprise. He had resolved that his reign would begin with decisive action, and that his mother's companion, the man who had governed in his name, would govern no more. The confrontation was swift. Mortimer, caught unprepared, had no time to rally his supporters. Isabella, startled, is said to have pleaded for restraint, but Edward would not be swayed. He declared that he was now of age, that the time of regency had ended, and that Mortimer would answer for his usurpation. The man who had ruled England with such confidence was taken into custody before he could resist. The coup was complete before dawn. The news spread quickly. For many, it was as though a weight had been lifted. The nobles who had bristled under Mortimer's dominance rejoiced to see him overthrown. Parliament and council recognized the authority of the king, no longer a youth in the shadow of regents, but a monarch asserting his own right. Mortimer's estates and titles were forfeit, his influence erased. Isabella, though spared humiliation, was withdrawn from public affairs, her power gently but firmly curtailed. Edward III had taken the first true step into kingship. His boldness at Nottingham marked the end of one era and the beginning of another. No longer could he be dismissed as a figurehead. He had demonstrated that he possessed the courage, intelligence, and resolve required of a sovereign. The memory of his father's weakness, the turmoil of the regency, and the bitterness of noble discontent had forged within him a determination never to be overshadowed again. Thus, the reign of Edward III truly began, not with inheritance alone, but with action. England had a king who would rule in his own right, and the course of the realm was about to change. The boy who had worn the crown in silence had now claimed it in truth, and the path ahead would lead him not only to secure his throne, but to project his claim beyond the Channel, into the heart of France itself. With Mortimer gone and Isabella withdrawn from the center of power, Edward III at last stood unchallenged. Yet to seize the throne was one matter. To define what kind of king he would be was another. The memories of his father's failures still hung heavily over England. Edward knew he must not only rule, but embody a vision strong enough to restore trust and inspire loyalty. His thoughts turned not to the weak reign he had just ended, but to the figures who had once made the Plantagenet name resound across Christendom. Foremost among these was Richard the Lionheart, the crusading king whose exploits had entered legend. Though Richard had died more than a century earlier, his image still loomed large in the imagination of England and Europe. Chroniclers spoke of his courage in battle, his chivalry, and his relentless will. Songs and romances celebrated him as the archetype of a warrior king. For Edward, raised on these tales, Richard was a model not simply of strength but of glory, proof that a king could dominate both battlefield and legend. Closer in time stood Edward I, the grandfather he never knew, but whose legacy he could not ignore. Edward I, called Longshanks, had been a builder of law and a master of war. He had subdued Wales, hammered Scotland, and imposed the authority of the crown with a vigor few dared challenge. His memory was still fresh among the nobility, many of whom had served under him in their youth. To them, the contrast between grandfather and father was stark, and Edward III recognized that his task was to revive the stern majesty of Edward I while avoiding the softness and divisions of Edward II. These examples shaped more than ambition, they shaped identity. Edward III began to cultivate the image of the chivalric king, a sovereign who would not merely govern from halls and councils, but ride at the head of armies, preside over tournaments, and embody the knightly virtues of courage, loyalty, and honor. To a realm disillusioned by intrigue and favoritism, this image was magnetic. It offered not only stability, but inspiration, a sense that England could once again command respect abroad and unity at home. The ideals of chivalry were not mere ornament. In Edward's hands, they became a political tool and a cultural force. He surrounded himself with knights devoted to the code, rewarding valor and loyalty. He revived the pageantry of tournaments, not as idle sport, but as theater, demonstrations of martial skill and symbols of national pride. By doing so, he bound the nobility to him, not through fear as his father had tried, but through admiration and shared purpose. The vision of a king as the first knight of the realm gave Edward both legitimacy and charisma. Yet this was no empty pose. Edward's desire to restore Plantagenet greatness was rooted in strategy as well as symbolism. He understood that England's strength depended on more than internal peace. The loss of prestige in Scotland, the concessions of the Treaty of Northampton, and the shadow of French power all demanded reversal. His model kings, Richard the Lionheart and Edward the Verser, had defined themselves through conquest. To follow their example, Edward III would need to turn outward, to test his vision not only in council chambers, but on fields of war. For now, though, the emphasis was on foundation. He restructured his household to reflect his authority, promoted men of proven loyalty rather than reckless favorites, and began to reassert the dignity of the monarchy. Where Edward II had been mocked, Edward III sought to be revered. Where Mortimer had ruled through fear, Edward III aimed to lead through honor. The change was subtle at first, but the court began to shift. Chroniclers noted the confidence of the young king, the energy with which he presided over councils, the grace with which he appeared at ceremonies. England, weary of humiliation, sensed that something had altered. The crown once more had a bearer who looked and acted like a king. Thus, in the years immediately following Nottingham, Edward III defined himself not only by what he rejected, the corruption of Mortimer, the weakness of his father, but by what he embraced, the legacy of the Plantagenets at their strongest, the chivalric image of a monarch who fought alongside his men, and the dream of a kingdom restored to greatness. It was the beginning of a vision that would soon drive England into a conflict spanning generations, a vision born not merely of ambition, but of memory, legend, and the enduring call of glory. As Edward III matured into his reign, the vision of the chivalric king became more than a personal ideal. It evolved into the very structure of his court and the symbol of his monarchy. If Richard the Lionheart had lived in memory, and Edward I had left his mark in stone and law, Edward III sought to bind their legacy to his own through ritual and institution. He wanted a court that did not simply mirror the politics of power, but one that embodied loyalty, honor, and the brotherhood of arms. Out of this desire, in 1348, he founded the Order of the Garter. The order was unlike anything England had known before. It was not simply a gathering of nobles, but a chosen fellowship, limited in number and bound by oath. At its heart was the king himself, first among equals, and around him were knights selected for valor, loyalty, and service. They were not chosen only for their wealth or lineage, but for the deeds that proved their worth on the battlefield and in the defense of the realm. This exclusivity gave the order both prestige and power. To be admitted was to be acknowledged not only as a servant of the crown, but as a companion of the king. The symbolism of the garter itself was simple yet profound. Legends told of its origin in a courtly incident when a lady dropped a garter during a dance, and Edward, lifting it, declared, "Shame on him who thinks ill of this." Whether apocryphal or not, the story reflected the ethos of the order: honor reclaimed from mockery, dignity defended in the face of scorn. For Edward, the garter became a circle of loyalty, a sign that bound him to his chosen knights and them to him. The order was tied to St. George, England's patron saint, whose cross had long been carried into battle. By linking his fellowship to the saint, Edward gave it not only martial but spiritual legitimacy. The chapel of St. George at Windsor Castle became its spiritual home, and there the knights gathered for ceremonies that blended pageantry with devotion. The setting was deliberate. Windsor was both fortress and palace, a symbol of the Plantagenet dynasty's endurance. Within its walls, Edward created a stage upon which his vision of kingship could be enacted year after year. The Order of the Garter was more than ornament. It was a political instrument. In an age when noble loyalty could be uncertain, Edward bound his leading magnates into a company where rivalry was sublimated into shared honor. Instead of competing for influence as courtiers, they were united as companions of the king. The order created a hierarchy of prestige that only Edward could bestow, and in doing so, it reinforced his centrality to the realm. A king who had once been overshadowed by regents now stood at the center of a carefully crafted circle of loyalty. The timing of the order's foundation in the late 1340s was itself significant. England was emerging from the devastation of the Black Death, a plague that had claimed countless lives and shaken every household. Amid such loss, the creation of the order signaled renewal. It reminded England that the crown endured, that chivalry and loyalty could still flourish, even in a world scarred by tragedy. For nobles and commoners alike, the image of Edward presiding over his fellowship was a reassurance that the monarchy was not merely surviving, but reimagining itself. Through the Order of the Garter, Edward III gave tangible form to his vision of a chivalric monarchy. He was no longer only aspiring to the glory of Richard or the strength of Edward I, he was carving his own place in history, establishing an institution that would endure long after his death. To this day, the order remains the oldest and most prestigious order of chivalry in England, a living echo of a 14th century king who understood that power rested not only on armies and laws, but on symbols that bound men together. In shaping this fellowship, Edward did more than flatter the ideals of his age. He transformed them into the very architecture of his kingship. The young monarch who had seized power at Nottingham now stood as a mature ruler, crowned not only with gold, but with the loyalty of his chosen companions. His court became a stage for chivalry, his reign a canvas upon which the Plantagenet vision of honor and glory was painted anew. The year 1328 brought a moment that would alter the destiny of Europe. In France, the last direct male heir of the Capuchin line, Charles the Doge, breathed his last. His reign had been brief, his rule cautious, but his death without a surviving son created a void that could not be ignored. For more than 3 centuries, the Capuchins had ruled France without interruption, passing the crown from father to son in an unbroken chain. That chain was now snapped, and the question of who should inherit the throne unsettled the most powerful kingdom of Christendom. There were claimants aplenty, but 2 stood above all others. On one side was Philip of Valois, cousin to the late king and closest male relative in the direct French line. On the other stood Edward III of England, the teenage grandson of Philip IV through his mother, Isabella of France. Blood and law collided in this contest, and the fate of nations would depend upon how those bonds were interpreted. Edward's claim was not a trivial one. His mother Isabella had been the daughter of a king. His grandfather, Philip III, had ruled with great majesty, and his uncles, Louis VI, Philip V, and Charles V, had all worn the crown. By the principle of descent through the female line, Edward could present himself as the rightful heir. Indeed, at the time of Charles IV's death, he was the nearest male descendant of Philip IV, though not through direct paternal succession. To the English court, and to those who favored his cause, the claim was legitimate, rooted in blood as well as precedent. The French nobility, however, reached for a different solution. They invoked what became known as the Salic Law, an ancient Frankish code that barred inheritance of the throne through the female line. While its exact application to the crown was debated, the principle provided a convenient means to exclude Edward. To admit his claim would be to accept that the crown of France might fall under English control, uniting two powerful kingdoms under a single monarch. For the French barons, this was unthinkable. By acclaim, they turned to Philip of Valois, who was crowned as Philip VI at Reims, the sacred seat of French coronations. The decision was not merely legal, but political. The memory of England's long rivalry with France, from disputes over Normandy to the lingering question of Gascony, weighed heavily. To grant the throne to Edward III would be to invite England's dominance at the very heart of the French realm. By elevating Philip VI, the French nobility secured a king who was both native and dependent on their support. The Valois line thus began, but it did so under the cloud of a contested claim. In England, the matter was received with mixed tones. At first, Edward appeared willing to acknowledge Philip VI, even performing homage for the Duchy of Gascony, which he held as a fief from the French crown. But the seed of grievance had been planted. To be set aside, despite his bloodline, was a slight that would linger in his mind. The young king, who had already defined himself through the ideals of honor and chivalry, could not easily ignore the denial of what he believed to be his birthright. The chronicles of the time sensed the magnitude of the moment. Some presented the succession as a straightforward matter of French law, others as a manipulation by powerful lords determined to exclude a foreigner. Later historians would see in this dispute the spark of the 100 Years' War, for beneath the legal arguments lay deeper tensions, national pride, economic rivalry, and the struggle for supremacy between two ambitious monarchies. Thus, the Capetian succession crisis became more than a question of inheritance. It was a mirror reflecting the anxieties of an age, the fear of foreign rule, the fragility of dynastic continuity, and the assertion of new principles of sovereignty. For Edward III, the outcome was both a wound and a challenge. He had been denied a crown, but in that denial lay the cause around which he would marshal armies, forge alliances, and reshape the map of Europe. The year 1328 closed with Philip VI seated upon the throne of France, his coronation celebrated with splendor, his authority proclaimed by the peers of the realm. Yet beyond the pomp, a rival claim endured. Across the Channel, Edward III watched, remembered, and waited. The boy who had seized his throne at Nottingham now gazed across the sea, his thoughts fixed not only on England's honor, but on a kingdom he believed to be his own. The stage was set, and though the storm would not break at once, the clouds of a century-long conflict had begun to gather. If dynastic claims set the stage for war, the forces of economy and trade gave the quarrel its fuel. In the 14th century, the wealth of northern Europe pulsed through the looms of Flanders. Bruges, Ghent, and Ypres thrived as centers of weaving and commerce, their streets crowded with merchants and artisans whose skill turned raw wool into fine cloth coveted across the continent. Yet this prosperity depended on a single source, the wool of England. Without the steady stream of fleeces from English pastures, the looms of Flanders would fall silent. This dependency was not lost on either side of the Channel. English monarchs knew their wool was no mere commodity. It was a weapon of policy. Taxes levied on exports filled the royal treasury, funding courts and armies alike. Merchants and guilds in the Low Countries recognized the delicate balance. They needed England's wool, but they also relied on the political umbrella of France, whose kings claimed overlordship over Flanders. Thus, the region became a fault line where the ambitions of Edward III and Philip VI collided. For the French crown, Flanders was both a prize and a risk. The Counts of Flanders, often torn between loyalty to their liege lord in Paris and the economic lifeline from England, walked a narrow path. When Philip VI tightened his grip on their allegiance, he inevitably threatened the flow of trade upon which their towns depended. The Flemish cities, proud and wealthy, were not easily subdued. Their guilds wielded power as formidable as noble lances, and they looked across the sea to England as much as they bowed to France. Edward III understood this tension and exploited it skillfully. By courting Flemish towns, offering them security of supply and promises of alliance, he built a network of sympathy across the Low Countries. The merchants of Bruges and Ghent saw in him not only a distant king, but a guarantor of their livelihoods. When French envoys pressed for loyalty, the artisans whispered of their dependence on English wool. Economics thus intertwined with politics, turning the loom into a battleground as critical as any field of war. The rivalry was sharpened by embargoes and countermeasures. At times, England restricted the export of wool, wielding famine of cloth as a threat. France retaliated by seeking to cut off markets, attempting to draw Flanders more firmly into its orbit. These maneuvers hurt common workers most of all, sparking unrest in the cities where livelihoods hung on the rhythm of the shuttle and the dye vat. Yet beneath these struggles lay the greater contest, whether the economy of Northern Europe would be bent to English advantage or French control. Chroniclers of the time were keenly aware of the stakes. One wrote that the fleece of England is the gold of Christendom, and indeed it was true. Armies marched, and castles rose upon revenues drawn from wool. The balance of trade meant the balance of power, and the king who controlled it commanded more than soldiers. He commanded the lifeblood of commerce. The crisis of the 1320s and 1330s revealed how fragile this balance could be. Flemish discontent with French interference simmered into revolt, most famously under the leadership of Jacob van Artevelde in Ghent. He championed alliance with England, arguing that the prosperity of Flanders could not survive without it. For Edward III, such voices were a godsend. They gave him not only allies abroad, but justification at home. To defend English interests was to defend the realm's prosperity and the livelihoods of its people. Thus, the economic rivalry was never a matter of coin alone. It struck at the heart of sovereignty. To France, control over Flanders meant securing the northern frontier and the prestige of royal authority. To England, access to Flanders was the keystone of trade and the key to influence on the continent. Every bale of wool shipped across the Channel carried with it the weight of politics and the potential for conflict. By the eve of open war, dynastic claims and economic tensions had fused into a single cause. Edward's claim to the French crown was entwined with the defense of English commerce, while Philip's assertion of Valois power was inseparable from the attempt to dominate Flanders. The looms and markets of the Low Countries thus became as important to the coming struggle as knights and castles. In the hum of the workshops and the clamor of the guild halls could be heard the distant drumbeat of a war that would engulf generations. Even as Edward III wore the crown of England, he carried the burden of a feudal bond that tethered him to the French king. For all his power across the Channel, he remained the Duke of Gascony, a vast duchy in southwestern France that stretched from the vineyards of Bordeaux to the Pyrenean foothills. This land was England's jewel on the continent, rich in wine and trade, but by the laws of feudal order, it was not fully his own. In name and ceremony, he held it as a fief from the King of France. The arrangement was a relic of centuries of conflict and compromise. Since the days of the Angevin Empire, when English kings had ruled nearly half of France, the map had shrunk, but the entanglement endured. The Treaty of Paris in 1259 had confirmed the English right to Gascony, but only in exchange for homage. Thus, even the mightiest king of England was bound to kneel before his rival in Paris. For Edward III, whose vision of kingship was rooted in chivalric pride and dynastic ambition, such submission was a bitter humiliation. The practical consequences of this feudal tie were endless disputes. French officials, acting in the name of their king, interfered in Gascon justice, summoned English subjects to French courts, and threatened confiscation at the slightest provocation. To the Gascons, loyal to their trade with England but legally under the crown of France, this double allegiance was a constant strain. To Edward, it was intolerable. He was king in Westminster, yet treated as a vassal in Bordeaux. The coronation of Philip VI deepened the tension. When Edward performed homage in 1329, he did so with visible reluctance. Chroniclers noted his discomfort, the unease of a monarch compelled to bow before another whose crown he believed was rightfully his own. At first, this homage was couched in careful diplomacy, a gesture to preserve peace, but beneath the ceremony lay resentment, sharpened each time the French crown pressed its rights over Gascony. The very language of feudalism added fuel to the quarrel. The French view, Edward was a subject of the Valois king in all matters concerning Gascony, bound to obedience like any other duke or count. In the English view, he was a sovereign who owed only conditional homage, not servitude. The ambiguity between liege homage and simple homage, between full loyalty and partial duty, became a fertile ground for conflict. Each side interpreted the oaths to its advantage, and each saw the other as violating sacred custom. By the 1330s, the disputes grew sharper. French courts summoned Gascon lords to answer charges in Paris, undermining Edward's authority in his own duchy. The threat of confiscation hung perpetually over Gascony, wielded by Philip VI as a means to discipline his ambitious neighbor. For Edward, already stung by the denial of his claim to the French crown, such interference was more than insult. It was an attack on his sovereignty. Gascony's importance magnified the stakes. Its vineyards supplied wine to England's tables. Its ports connected trade to Iberia, and its loyalty bound the Plantagenet crown to continental influence. To lose it would be to sever England from Europe. To defend it was to invite confrontation with France. Thus, the duchy became the stage upon which the larger conflict would unfold, a land where legal arguments and feudal rituals carried the weight of armies. In this web of feudal obligations, both kings saw more than custom. For Philip VI, asserting lordship over Edward was a way to display his legitimacy as the new ruler of France. For Edward III, resisting that lordship was bound to his chivalric identity and dynastic cause. To kneel too deeply was to surrender pride. To resist too openly was to risk war. The tension could not be contained forever. By the middle of the century, dynastic claim, economic rivalry, and feudal entanglement had fused into a single crisis. Edward's role as vassal to the French king was incompatible with his identity as an independent monarch and impossible to reconcile with his claim to the crown of France itself. The contradiction was clear to all. One could not be both vassal and rival king. In this paradox lay the seed of a conflict that would stretch beyond lifetimes, a war where the parchment of feudal charters would be tested by the steel of armies. By 1337, the long-brewing conflict could no longer be contained. For nearly a decade, Edward III had lived with the uneasy contradiction of being both a sovereign king and a vassal duke, bound to the crown of France through Gascony. He had borne the indignities of homage, the constant interference of French officials, and the lingering insult of being passed over for the Capetian succession. Now the tension had reached its breaking point. Philip VI of France, emboldened by his authority and determined to secure his line, declared Gascony forfeit. The duchy, jewel of England's continental possessions, was to be seized in the name of the French crown. For Edward, this act was not simply a challenge to his rights as duke. It was an assault on his sovereignty as king. The confiscation of Gascony transformed grievances into open rupture, and Edward responded with a declaration that would alter the course of European history. In 1337, he proclaimed himself the rightful king of France, heir not only by blood as grandson of Philip IV, but by justice denied. No longer would he bend knee to the Valois. Instead, he raised his standard as a monarch who sought to claim what he believed was his inheritance. The claim was more than personal pride. It was strategy. By asserting his right to the French crown, Edward placed himself on equal footing with Philip VI and turned the quarrel from a feudal dispute into a contest of sovereignty. The rivalry was no longer duke against king, but king against king. This shift gave Edward a powerful narrative. He was not rebelling against his overlord, he was contending for his throne. It allowed him to frame the war as a matter of legitimacy, not rebellion, and to draw allies who shared his opposition to French dominance. Chief among these allies were the towns of Flanders. Their wealth, spun from English wool, tied their fortunes to the friendship of England more than to the command of Paris. In Bruges, Ghent, and Ypres, guilds of weavers and merchants had long resented the heavy hand of the French crown. Edward's claim offered them an alternative: support a monarch who could secure their trade and protect their independence. The alliance was forged in diplomacy and sealed with promises of mutual benefit. With Flemish support, Edward could threaten the very heart of northern France, where the kingdom's richest cities and strongest fortresses stood. The prospect of English banners marching alongside Flemish militias sent tremors through Philip's court. The northern frontier, once a shield of prosperity, now looked vulnerable. The Valois crown faced not only a dynastic rival, but a coalition of economic powerhouses willing to defy its authority. Edward's alliance gave him ports, supplies, and a staging ground from which to launch campaigns into French territory. The Declaration of 1337 did not yet bring vast armies crashing against one another, but it marked a point of no return. From this moment, the quarrel ceased to be a matter of local grievances. It became a struggle for the soul of two kingdoms, for mastery of Christendom's stage. Edward styled himself not merely as King of England, but as King of France and England, a title emblazoned on his seals and proclaimed in his charters. The union he envisioned was no mere dream of conquest, but a bold statement that the Plantagenet line remained equal, if not superior, to the Valois. Chroniclers noted the drama of the moment. To some, Edward appeared reckless, a young monarch intoxicated by ambition. To others, he was a figure of destiny, asserting rights that had been denied by legal sophistry and political maneuvering. In the taverns of Flanders and the halls of Westminster alike, the question was no longer whether war would come, but when and where the first blows would fall. Thus, the year 1337 passed into memory as the true beginning of what later generations would call the 100 Years' War. The clash of dynasties had merged with the clash of economies, and feudal disputes had evolved into a struggle of kingdoms. England and France, bound for centuries in rivalry, were now set on a course of open confrontation. And at the center of it all stood Edward III, his banners raised, his claim declared, his gaze fixed on the crown of France. The Declaration of 1337 did not at once unleash great armies onto the fields of France. At first, the struggle unfolded across borders and sea lanes, in raids, skirmishes, and maneuvering for advantage. Both Edward III and Philip VI knew that war would not be decided in a single season. Each sought to test the strength of the other, probing for weakness while building alliances. In this early phase, the sea became the first great arena of contest. Control of the Channel was not a matter of pride alone. Whoever ruled its waters commanded the movement of armies, the flow of trade, and the safety of coasts. For France, with allies in Scotland and ambitions to strike at England itself, naval dominance promised the chance to carry war directly across the Channel. For Edward, mastery of the seas was essential to sustain his alliances in Flanders and to bring his armies onto continental soil. The opening years saw a series of raids and counter-raids. French fleets harried the southern English coast, burning towns and disrupting shipping. English ships struck back in kind, attacking ports in Normandy and Brittany. The Channel became a restless frontier where merchants sailed in fear and fishermen found themselves swept into war. Yet neither side gained clear superiority until 1340. That summer, Edward assembled a fleet unlike any England had sent before. Merchant vessels were pressed into service, their decks reinforced, their crews armed. It was a navy born of necessity, a coalition of royal ships and commercial craft bound together by the urgency of war. With it, Edward sought not merely to defend his shores, but to challenge France for control of the sea. The French had gathered their fleet at the port of Sluys, near the estuaries of Flanders. Hundreds of ships lay anchored there, a forest of masts bristling against the horizon. Philip VI believed his navy strong enough to block Edward's passage, to bottle him in England and isolate his Flemish allies. The French fleet, larger and well-positioned, seemed poised to deliver a decisive blow. On June 24, 1340, the two forces met. Chroniclers describe the battle as one of the most ferocious sea fights of the age. Edward's fleet advanced with the wind at its back, striking at the French ships chained together in defensive lines. The clash was unlike the great land battles of chivalric legend. Here men fought on the decks of rolling ships, amid sails and rigging, where the sea itself became a weapon as vessels crashed together. Edward commanded from the cog Thomas, urging his men forward. The English archers, so feared on land, proved devastating at sea, loosing storms of arrows that rained upon French decks. Grappling hooks bound ship to ship, and sailors and knights alike surged across the planks to seize control. The chaos of masts and ropes became a battlefield of its own, where discipline and resolve triumphed over numbers. By nightfall, the French fleet lay shattered. Chroniclers spoke of near total destruction, of a navy reduced to wreckage upon the tide. For Edward, the victory at Sluys was more than a triumph of arms. It was a transformation of the war itself. The Channel was now England's highway, not France's barrier. With the French fleet destroyed, Edward could move his armies freely to the continent. The threat of invasion from France was lifted, and the balance of the conflict had shifted dramatically. The news of Sluys echoed across Europe. To allies in Flanders, it was proof that Edward was not merely a claimant, but a commander to be reckoned with. To France, it was a shock that revealed the vulnerability of its coasts and the peril of underestimating the English. The battle marked the end of the war's hesitant beginnings and the opening of a new phase, one in which Edward could bring the full weight of his ambition against the Valois on land as well as sea. Thus, by 1340, the 100 Years' War had found its first great turning point. What had begun as a quarrel of inheritance and homage now resounded with the crash of fleets and the cries of battle upon the waters of Sluys. Edward III had declared himself a king of France. Now he had shown he could wield the power to make that claim a living threat. The sea was his, and through it, the path to France lay open. The victory at Sluys had given Edward III command of the sea, but for the young monarch, mastery of the waves was only the prelude. If he was to be recognized not merely as a claimant, but as a king of France, he needed to prove himself on land, where crowns were won and lost in the clash of armies. It was in this moment that Edward began to craft the image that would define him for generations. The warrior king, a sovereign who led not from the safety of a chamber, but from the saddle, armored and resolute at the head of his host. From the outset, Edward embraced the role with conviction. He had grown up in the shadow of legends. Richard the Lionheart, his great-grandfather Edward I, the models of kingship that fused rule with valor. Now, with banners unfurled and the fleur-de-lis added boldly to his arms, he set about embodying their spirit. Chroniclers describe him riding among his knights in gleaming mail, his helm adorned, his presence unmistakable amid the throng. To see Edward in battle array was to see a king who had bound his destiny to the fortunes of his soldiers. The campaigns of 1339 and 1340 brought this image to life. Edward crossed the Channel not to observe from afar, but to place himself at the heart of the enterprise. At Tournai, one of the great strongholds of Flanders, he laid siege in person, directing the labor of trenches and engines, standing among his men in rain and mud. His enemies might sneer at his claim, but none could deny his courage. He rode the lines, speaking to archers and men-at-arms, a king visible, tangible, sharing the hardships of war. Such scenes mattered as much as victories. In the chivalric culture of the 14th century, kingship was measured not only by governance, but by personal valor. To be a true sovereign was to be a knight as well as a ruler. Edward understood this ideal deeply. He dined in the field with his captains, took counsel from seasoned warriors, and ensured that his presence was felt in every skirmish. To his followers, this was not merely leadership, it was inspiration. To fight under Edward was to fight with a monarch who seemed chosen for the age of arms. The image spread quickly through Europe. Chroniclers, troubadours, and messengers carried tales of the young king who rode armored and unflinching against the Valois. In Flanders, he was hailed as a champion of townsmen and guilds, a protector of commerce who wielded both sword and seal. In England, he became the very embodiment of Plantagenet vigor, a sharp contrast to the troubled memory of his father. Where Edward II had been mocked as weak and pliable, Edward III was celebrated as bold and commanding. Yet the warrior king's image was not mere theater, it was strategy. By presenting himself as a knight among knights, Edward won loyalty not only from his own barons, but from allies abroad. The nobility of the Low Countries, the dukes and counts of the empire, found in him a figure they could rally behind. His charisma in the field turned political alliances into martial brotherhoods, binding disparate interests into a common cause. The siege of Tournai itself did not yield the triumph Edward had hoped. The city resisted stubbornly, and after weeks of hardship, negotiations brought only a truce. But the campaign left behind something more enduring than conquest, the image of a king forged in armor. Even in stalemate, Edward's reputation grew. He had shown Europe that he would not shrink from the hardships of war, that he was a sovereign of steel as well as crown. Thus, by 1340, Edward III had begun to shape the legend of his reign. He was no longer merely the claimant who declared himself King of France, nor the strategist who broke the French fleet at Sluys. He was the warrior king, a monarch who rode at the head of his people, a knight whose destiny was written in the clash of arms. This vision would guide his reign, inspire his followers, and haunt his enemies. In the years to come, the world would see the warrior king tested in battles that would echo across the century. By the mid-1340s, Edward III had already proven himself a king of action, a sovereign who wore armor as naturally as a crown. Yet his destiny as the warrior king awaited a greater test, one that would etch his name into the annals of European warfare. That test came in the summer of 1346, when the armies of England and France converged on the fields near the small village of Crécy in northern France. Edward's campaign began with boldness. Landing in Normandy with a force smaller than that of his Valois rival, he embarked on a sweeping chevauchée across French territory. His men moved swiftly through the countryside, seizing supplies, striking at towns, and drawing Philip's Essex into pursuit. It was a campaign designed not merely for plunder, but to provoke a decisive confrontation, to prove that Edward could meet the might of France in open battle. By August, Philip's host had gathered, vast, glittering, and confident. The French king commanded the flower of European chivalry, armored knights from across his realm, banners of dukes and counts, mercenaries from abroad. Chroniclers marveled at the splendor of the Valois army, its numbers perhaps double that of Edward's force. Yet, grandeur is not the same as discipline, and the army of France, for all its strength, was bound by traditions of valor that no longer fit the changing art of war. Edward chose his ground with care. On a slope near Crécy, he arrayed his forces in 3 divisions, placing his young son, the Prince of Wales, later famed as the Black Prince, in command of one. English men-at-arms formed solid ranks, but it was the archers wielding the longbow who gave Edward his hidden edge. Their weapon, drawn with the strength of seasoned arms, could send arrows farther and faster than any crossbow. It was a technology that transformed warfare, granting infantry a power once reserved for the knightly class. As the French advanced on the afternoon of August 26th, the storm broke. Philip's cavalry surged forward in waves, the thunder of hooves shaking the ground. But the slope, the mud of recent rains, and the disciplined English ranks blunted their charge. The longbowmen loosed their arrows in a relentless storm. Shafts darkened the sky, striking with such force that horses faltered and knights reeled. Charge after charge was repulsed, valor meeting, not sword to sword, but arrow to armor. The Genoese crossbowmen, hired by France, were sent forward to break the English line, yet their bows lacked the range and speed of the English longbow. When they faltered, Philip's knights pressed them aside in frustration, only to ride into the same deadly storm. Confusion spread across the French host as formations crumbled and the field turned against them. Through it all, Edward maintained calm. From a windmill on the ridge, he directed the battle, sending reinforcements where needed, but never losing sight of the greater plan. When his son's division came, under severe pressure, messengers rode to the king for aid. Edward is said to have replied that the boy must win his spurs that day, refusing to intervene so the prince could earn his honor. The tale, whether polished by chroniclers or true in detail, captured the essence of Edward's leadership: trust in preparation, faith in discipline, and a vision of kingship that fused authority with the ideals of chivalry. As night fell, the French assaults had spent themselves. The once proud host lay scattered, its spirit broken by the unyielding defense of a smaller but more disciplined foe. Crécy was not merely a victory, it was a revelation. The dominance of mounted knights, unchallenged for centuries, had been humbled by the precision of infantry and the power of the longbow. The age of warfare was changing before Europe's eyes. For Edward, the triumph confirmed his place as one of the great commanders of his age. He had faced the full might of France and prevailed not through numbers, but through strategy, technology, and resolve. His son, scarcely 16, emerged from the field with glory, cementing the dynasty's martial image. And England, watching from afar, saw in its king the embodiment of the warrior ideal, a monarch who stood at the crossroads of tradition and transformation. The victory at Crécy echoed across Christendom. To some, it was divine favor, a sign that Edward's claim to the French crown bore the blessing of heaven. To others, it was proof that the world of arms was shifting, that the future belonged not solely to nobles on horseback, but to the common archer whose bow could humble kings. Whatever the interpretation, the result was clear. Edward had struck a blow that would resonate for generations. Thus, in the fields of Crécy, the warrior king found his legend. He had faced the odds, stood firm against the tide, and reshaped the art of battle. The 100 Years' War was far from over. It had scarcely begun, but its course had been altered. Edward III had written his name not only into the chronicles of his own time, but into the very fabric of military history. The triumph at Crécy had shaken France, but Edward III knew that battles alone could not secure his foothold. To sustain his claim and his presence on the continent, he needed a strong port, an anchor from which England could supply armies and project power into northern France. His eyes fell upon Calais, a bustling harbor town whose position on the channel made it the perfect prize. To hold Calais was to command a gateway between England and France. And so, in September 1346, Edward set his army before its walls, beginning a siege that would last nearly a year. Calais was no ordinary town, protected by formidable fortifications and surrounded by marshlands. It was nearly impregnable. The French crown, desperate to keep the port in its hands, promised support. But Edward had prepared with care. His fleet now ruled the channel, cutting off supplies. By sea, while his armies encircled the town on land, slowly, relentlessly, the noose tightened. Inside Calais, food dwindled, hunger crept through the streets, and the townspeople endured the long winter with growing despair. Edward himself remained at the siege, embodying again the image of the warrior king. He turned the campaign into a test of endurance, living among his soldiers, directing the construction of camps and fortifications, ensuring that no relief could break through. Chroniclers speak of the order and discipline of the English lines, where tents and wooden huts stood in neat rows, a city of war facing a city of stone. The months dragged on, but Edward would not be moved. By the summer of 1347, Calais could endure no longer. Starvation had done what sword and cannon could not. The gates opened, and the town sued for surrender. What followed would become one of the most remembered scenes of the 100 Years' War. Edward, determined to make an example, demanded that 6 of the town's leading citizens come forth barefoot, dressed in shirts, with ropes around their necks, carrying the keys of the city in their hands. These burghers, symbols of their community, would offer themselves in humiliation to the king's mercy. The moment was one of profound drama. Jean de Vienne, the town's commander, selected the 6 men who walked through the gates to face Edward's camp. Chroniclers describe them with heads bowed, the weight of the city's suffering upon their shoulders. They knelt before Edward, presenting the keys, ready to give their lives to save their fellow citizens. To the English army, it was a spectacle of submission. To the world, it was a vision of sacrifice and dignity. Edward, stern in victory, was inclined to have them executed, to mark Calais' fall with blood and warning. Yet it was here that another figure intervened, Queen Philippa of Hainaut, who had accompanied her husband on campaign. Moved by compassion, she knelt before Edward and pleaded for their lives. Her words, chroniclers say, touched the king's heart. To deny his queen in such a moment of humility would tarnish his honor. Edward relented, sparing the burghers, and thus turned a scene of severity into one of enduring legend. The burghers of Calais became a symbol for generations to come, of sacrifice, of civic virtue, of mercy amid the harshness of medieval war. Their story was retold in chronicles, celebrated in art, and centuries later immortalized by Rodin in bronze. For Edward, the mercy did not weaken his victory. Calais was emptied of its French inhabitants, resettled by loyal English subjects, and transformed into a fortress colony that would remain in English hands for over 2 centuries. The fall of Calais gave Edward more than glory. It gave him a permanent foothold, a base that secured supply lines, strengthened alliances, and allowed England to project force deep into France. More than Crécy, it marked the beginning of sustained English presence on continental soil. From this moment onward, Calais was England's bridgehead, the keystone of Edward's continental policy. Thus, the siege of Calais closed the first great act of the war. Edward had declared himself King of France, won the sea at Sluys, triumphed on land at Crécy, and now held a port that gave permanence to his ambitions. The 100 Years' War was far from finished, but Edward III had shown that he was not a pretender to be dismissed. He was a king who could bend fortune to his will, a warrior who had claimed both battlefield and city, and a ruler whose legend grew with every victory. The fall of Calais in 1347 was more than the conclusion of a siege. It was the beginning of a new chapter in Anglo-French rivalry. For Edward III, the capture of the port marked not only a triumph of arms, but a transformation of England's place in Europe. Where once the Plantagenet claim to France had been words and symbols, it was now anchored in stone walls and harbor waters that England would hold for generations. Calais was unlike any conquest before. Its location on the narrowest stretch of the Channel made it a jewel of strategic brilliance. From its harbor, England could supply armies, channel trade, and project power across northern France with ease. No longer would English kings be reliant on tenuous footholds or temporary campaigns. With Calais secured, they possessed a permanent bridgehead, a fortress colony from which to sustain their war. For more than 2 centuries, through shifting tides of fortune, Calais would remain English, a symbol of endurance as well as ambition. The victory also cemented Edward's reputation as master of war. In less than a decade, he had humbled the French navy at Sluys, shattered the chivalry of France at Crécy, and now taken one of the most valuable ports in Christendom. Few monarchs of the age could claim such a record. To his subjects in England, he appeared as the very embodiment of the warrior king, bold, disciplined, and unyielding. To allies abroad, he was a monarch whose banners brought success. Even his enemies, though they cursed his name, recognized the force of his will. The capture of Calais carried symbolic weight as well. It demonstrated that Edward's war was not simply a series of raids, not a fleeting adventure across the Channel, but a sustained effort backed by vision and persistence. Where many had doubted his claim to the French crown, dismissing it as youthful bravado, Calais stood as proof that he could not only declare, but endure. He had turned victory at Crécy into a lasting foothold, showing that the Plantagenet cause was more than rhetoric. It was reality. In the wider landscape of medieval Europe, the fall of Calais shifted perceptions of power. France, long seen as the mightiest kingdom of Christendom, had been forced to watch as one of its great cities was taken and held by a rival. The blow to Valois' prestige was immense. Meanwhile, England, smaller in land and population, had shown that through strategy, discipline, and the longbow's sting, it could stand equal, if not superior, to its larger neighbor. Calais became the emblem of this reversal, a constant reminder to France of its vulnerability and to England of its strength. The burghers who had once knelt in ropes before Edward remained in memory as figures of sacrifice, but the city itself became thoroughly transformed. Its French inhabitants were expelled, replaced by loyal settlers from across the Channel. The port bustled with English merchants, soldiers, and administrators. It became less a French city under occupation and more an English possession in truth. A place where the king's writ ran as firmly as in London or Dover. The colony of Calais was both a symbol and a tool of domination, shaping trade routes and diplomatic strategies alike. For Edward personally, the conquest was a vindication. It confirmed that his claim to be King of France was backed not only by lineage, but by strength. He had taken his vision of kingship, the chivalric monarch who led in person, who proved his worth in battle, and turned it into fact. Chroniclers praised him as a new Alexander, a sovereign whose deeds matched his ambitions. His court, adorned with the trappings of knighthood and glory, reflected the confidence of a ruler who had reshaped the balance of power. Yet the meaning of Calais was not confined to the 14th century. For over 200 years, it stood as England's last foothold on French soil, a monument to Edward's achievement and a legacy carried forward by his heirs. When it finally fell back to France in 1558, its loss was mourned as the end of an era. But the memory of its capture in 1347 remained one of the crowning glories of Edward III's reign. Thus, the Siege of Calais was not only a victory in war, but a defining moment in the making of the warrior king. Edward had secured more than territory, he had secured his legend. The 100 Years' War would continue, with reverses and triumphs still to come, but the name of Edward III was now firmly etched as the ruler who bent fortune to his command and carved a place for England among the great powers of Europe. The capture of Calais had secured Edward III's foothold in France, and for a moment it seemed that nothing could halt the momentum of his conquests. Yet in the very year of triumph, a far greater force began to move across Europe, a force no king, no army, and no fortress could resist. It did not wear armor or carry banners. It rode on the breath of the wind, in the holds of ships, in the fur of rats, and in the weakness of humankind itself. This was the Great Pestilence, what later generations would call the Black Death. It arrived in Europe in 1347, borne by merchant vessels traveling the trade routes of the Mediterranean. Within months, the infection spread from port to port, Messina, Genoa, Marseille, then inland through markets and towns. By 1348, it crossed into the heartlands of France and England. Chroniclers, overwhelmed by the scale of it, struggled to find words. They spoke of cities emptying, of villages left silent, of fields untended. In both England and France, it is believed that nearly 1/3 of the population perished in those years. The war, so fierce only months before, faltered before this unseen adversary. Armies dwindled not by the strike of lance or arrow, but by absence. Campaigns planned with ambition dissolved as soldiers deserted or died. Even kings, for all their wealth, could not shield their courts. The splendor of banners and armor suddenly seemed powerless against the silence that followed the pestilence's wake. For Edward III, the plague was a paradox. On one hand, it froze the momentum of his continental campaigns. Troop numbers fell, revenues shrank as trade and taxation collapsed, and the alliances he had cultivated found themselves consumed by their own local crises. Yet on the other hand, England was not uniquely stricken. France, too, reeled under the same catastrophe. The kingdom that had so recently sought to resist him now faced its own devastation, its countryside emptied, its people reduced to despair. The pestilence did not distinguish between noble and peasant, priest and soldier. Entire households vanished, monasteries lost half their brethren, royal courts shrank in fear. In the Chronicles, one can sense not only grief, but bewilderment, a sense that the old order of the world had been overturned. Men and women had grown accustomed to the violence of war, to famine and hardship, but never had they seen mortality on such a scale. It was as though the foundations of Christendom trembled, society strained under the weight of absence. With fields untilled, grain harvests faltered, and famine threatened once more. Laborers who survived suddenly found themselves in demand, their hands more valuable than before. Wages rose, mobility increased, and the rigid structures of feudal obligation began to crack. In England, this tension simmered for years until it burst forth later in the century in the uprisings of peasants who refused to be bound again to the old order. In France, too, unrest grew as noble lords sought to tighten their grip, just as the people sought relief from centuries of dues and service. The war did not vanish, but it slowed. Suspended by necessity, the armies of England and France turned inward, less to the battlefield than to the graveyards. Yet even in pause, the hatred endured. Memories of Slies, Crécy, and Calais remained sharp. The claim of Edward III to the French crown was not forgotten, nor the humiliation of the Valois erased. If anything, the years of pestilence deepened the sense of grievance. For when people suffer, they look for causes, and many saw the enemy across the channel as both rival and scapegoat. Edward, like Philip VI, and later John II of France, confronted the reality that kingship in plague years was not measured by conquest, but by survival. His court withdrew at times into isolation, his campaigns postponed, his coffers strained, yet he continued to cultivate the image of resilience. To his people, he was not merely a warrior king now, but a ruler who endured alongside them through catastrophe. That endurance mattered, for though the pestilence killed more swiftly than any battle, it could not erase memory or ambition. By 1351, the worst of the plague had passed, leaving behind a Europe transformed. Populations had fallen, cities shrunk, monasteries emptied, but the war resumed, shaped now by a changed society. Armies were smaller, but soldiers were harder, trained by scarcity as much as by drill. Lords found their wealth diminished, yet their need for men greater than before. Kings discovered that their power depended not only on knights, but on the commons whose labor sustained them. The very fabric of feudal Christendom had been strained by the plague, and from the cracks emerged new expectations of rights, obligations, and resistance. The Black Death thus became a turning point in the 100 Years' War. It imposed a pause, but not an end. When fighting resumed, it was on ground both familiar and new. Familiar in that Edward and his heirs still pressed their claims to the French crown, new in that the societies they ruled were no longer the same. England had begun to shift toward a more mobile, assertive population, while France struggled with revolt and weakness amid depopulation. The chroniclers, writing in the shadow of both war and plague, sensed the enormity of the moment. They wrote not only of death, but of transformation. Some saw divine punishment, others divine trial, but all recognized that nothing would be as it had been before. The 100 Years' War would continue, but now against a backdrop of social upheaval, altered economies, and the haunting memory of empty villages. For Edward III, the pestilence had interrupted his ascent, yet it had also ensured his legacy. The warrior king who had triumphed at Crécy and Calais now stood as the sovereign who had guided England through calamity. His claim to France was not extinguished, it was merely delayed. And when the armies of Europe returned to the field, they carried with them not only banners and arms, but the unspoken knowledge of how fragile all human ambition could be. Thus, the shadow of plague fell across the 100 Years' War, halting its rhythm, reshaping its course, and reminding kings and peasants alike that beneath the clash of crowns lay the deeper, universal struggle for survival. When the pestilence at last loosened its grip on Europe, the kingdoms that remained were shadows of their former selves. Populations had thinned, villages lay silent, and wealth had drained away. Yet from this bleak soil, new chapters of the 100 Years' War were sown. Edward III, tempered by triumph and by tragedy, now looked to his sons to carry forward his legacy. Among them, one would rise to become not only the pride of England, but also the terror of France. Edward of Woodstock, remembered to history as the Black Prince. The young prince had been shaped in the crucible of war. At only 16, he had stood at Crécy, holding the line as arrows darkened the sky. That day had proven his courage. In the years that followed, he grew into a leader who embodied the very ideals of chivalry his father championed. With his dark armor, commanding presence, and fearless demeanor, he became the living image of the knightly king his father aspired to be. By 1356, destiny placed him at the heart of one of the most decisive battles of the age, the Battle of Poitiers. The campaign began with raids across the French countryside. The Black Prince led a chevauchée through Aquitaine, striking deep into enemy territory, his army living off the land, spreading fear and disruption. King John II of France, determined to avenge past defeats, mustered a great host to cut off the English retreat. At Poitiers, the two armies faced each other. The French outnumbered the English by far, their knights eager to crush the upstart prince who dared ravage their lands. Yet on the morning of September 19, 1356, it was not numbers that decided the fate of nations, but strategy and discipline. The Black Prince chose his ground carefully, positioning his forces behind hedges and vineyards that broke the charge of cavalry. His longbowmen once again played their part, loosing volleys that thinned the advancing French. The fields became a maze of broken charges as mounted knights, weighed down by armor and pressed forward in crowded ranks, struggled against the stubborn English lines. Through the chaos, the Black Prince held firm. He inspired his men with calm resolve, showing the same composure his father had once displayed at Crécy. His tactical brilliance turned the tide, feigned retreats lured French knights into traps, and disciplined counterattacks shattered their momentum. By day's end, the impossible had happened. Not only had the English held, they had triumphed. And in a moment that stunned Christendom, King John II of France himself was taken prisoner. The capture of a crowned king on the battlefield was almost without precedent. To seize not merely land, not merely plunder, but the very person of the monarch, it was a humiliation France had never imagined. John, clad in royal finery, was escorted into English custody, his crown and dignity stripped in an instant. Across Europe, the news spread like wildfire. England had not only defeated France again, it had humbled its king. The victory at Poitiers elevated Edward III's dynasty to unparalleled heights. His son's reputation soared. The Black Prince was hailed as the model of knighthood, admired even by enemies who had witnessed his courage. England itself swelled with pride, its king now possessing not only the battlefield, but also the bargaining power to dictate peace on his own terms. Those terms came in 1360 with the Treaty of Bretigny. After years of negotiation, France, weakened by defeat and burdened by ransom, was forced to yield vast concessions. Edward III renounced, for the moment, his claim to the French crown, but in exchange he was recognized as sovereign lord over a great swath of territory. Aquitaine, Poitou, and other lands expanded his dominion to its greatest extent since the days of Eleanor of Aquitaine and Henry II. It was a vision of the Plantagenet Empire reborn, stretching across the Channel, binding England and France under the reach of one dynasty. The ransom of King John was another symbol of England's dominance. Set at an enormous sum, it underscored the imbalance of power. France, fractured and impoverished by both war and plague, struggled to raise the money, while Edward's court flourished in splendor. Tournaments celebrated victories, chroniclers praised the king's wisdom and valor, and foreign rulers treated England with newfound respect. For a brief moment, Edward stood not only as the claimant to France, but as the undisputed master of Northern Europe. This was the golden age of his reign. At Windsor, Edward founded the Order of the Garter, surrounding himself with knights bound by ideals of loyalty and valor. His sons, the Black Prince and his brothers, embodied the vigor of a dynasty in full ascendancy. The people of England, though still scarred by pestilence, looked to their king as the guarantor of strength and glory. From the Channel ports to the castles of Aquitaine, the banners of St. George flew high, carried by soldiers who believed they fought under a monarch blessed by both skill and destiny. Yet within this triumph lay shadows. The cost of sustaining empire was immense, and the loyalty of conquered lands always fragile. France, though humbled, was not destroyed. Beneath the concessions of Bretigny, resentment smoldered, and the Valois monarchy plotted its recovery. The Black Prince himself, though radiant in youth, would carry burdens that no crown of chivalry could lighten. But in those years following Poitiers, the world saw Edward III at his zenith. He was no longer the uncertain youth overshadowed by Mortimer and Isabella. He was no longer the king struggling for recognition. He was the ruler whose son had captured a king, whose banners commanded fear and respect, whose treaties reshaped the map of Europe. Chroniclers did not hesitate to call this his Age of Gold. The 100 Years' War was far from over. Storms of rebellion, debt, and renewed conflict awaited. Yet in the middle years of the 14th century, Edward III seemed to have fulfilled the destiny of the warrior king. He had seized victory from chaos, turned pestilence into endurance, and carried his dynasty to the summit of glory. And in that summit, the name of the Black Prince shone beside his own. Father and son bound together as the architects of England's moment of greatness. The glory that had crowned Edward III in the years after Poitiers did not last forever. Time, inexorable and unyielding, began to draw its shadow across his reign. The warrior king who had once seemed invincible now faced losses that no sword or treaty could reverse. The golden banners of triumph gave way to the muted tones of grief, decline, and the bitter reality that even the mightiest monarchs must bow before age and fate. The first blow was personal, and it struck deep. In 1369, Queen Philippa of Hainaut, Edward's lifelong companion, died after decades of shared rule. She had been more than consort. She had been his partner in governance, his voice of compassion, his balance against the harshness of war. Her intercession at Calais had immortalized her in legend, but her influence had also tempered Edward's ambitions, keeping him tethered to mercy as well as conquest. Without her, the court seemed colder, emptier. Chroniclers note that the king himself never fully recovered from her passing, his vigor dimmed, his household shaken. As grief hollowed the king's heart, division unsettled his dynasty. Edward's sons, once the promise of a new Plantagenet age, began to fracture the unity that had underpinned his victories. The Black Prince, Edward of Woodstock, so radiant at Poitiers, was struck down not by enemy arms but by illness. His health failed steadily in the 1370s, leaving him a shadow of the knight who had captured a king. By 1376, he was dead, predeceasing his father and leaving behind only a young son, Richard of Bordeaux, too fragile a figure to anchor a turbulent kingdom. Other sons vied for influence. John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster, amassed vast estates and political clout, becoming a pillar of royal authority, but also a lightning rod for criticism. Thomas of Woodstock, ambitious and headstrong, sought to assert his place in a family that seemed both powerful and precarious. The royal household, once united in war, now splintered under the strain of succession and ambition. Edward, once the commanding figure at the heart of it all, receded, his authority eroded by infirmity and by the growing weight of younger voices. Meanwhile, across the Channel, France recovered. Charles V, the son of the captive John II, proved a shrewd and patient ruler. Known as the Wise, he rebuilt the strength of his kingdom, not through reckless charges, but through careful strategy. He avoided pitched battles where English archery might dominate, and instead relied on fortifications, attrition, and capable commanders like Bertrand du Guesclin. The tide of war shifted. Fortresses once held by England fell one by one, and the vast empire won at Bretigny began to shrink. By the late 1370s, England no longer commanded the dominance it had under Edward's prime. The cost of decades of war, combined with the lingering economic scars of the Black Death, left the kingdom strained. Tax burdens increased, sparking discontent at home. Parliament grew, more assertive, questioning royal expenditure and the conduct of the king's ministers. The once mighty image of Edward III as warrior king gave way to criticism of mismanagement and decline. The twilight of his reign was marked by contrast. On one hand, he remained the figure of legend, the victor of Crécy, the conqueror of Calais, the father of the Black Prince. On the other hand, he was an old man, weary and diminished, watching the fruits of his triumphs slip away. Chroniclers write of his final years as a time when the great king withdrew, his household plagued by corruption, his court overshadowed by younger, hungrier men who circled like hawks around the inheritance of his crown. In June 1377, Edward III died at Sheen, aged 64. He had reigned for 50 years, one of the longest in English history. The once vigorous warrior whose lance had struck terror into France passed away quietly, more in sorrow than in triumph. His grandson, the boy king Richard II, succeeded him, a fragile link in a chain that would soon strain and break. Yet even as decline colored his final years, Edward III's legacy endured. He had redefined kingship, embodying the ideal of the chivalric monarch who not only ruled but fought. He had inspired loyalty through victory, reshaped Europe's balance of power, and planted the seeds of a war that would span generations. The 100 Years' War, which began under his banner, would not end until 1453, long after his bones lay in Westminster Abbey. But its origins, its legends, its rhythms of glory and disaster all bore the mark of his reign. To England, he remained the image of the warrior king. His foundation of the Order of the Garter symbolized not only military triumph, but also the ideals of honor and fellowship. His victories at Calais, Crécy, and Poitiers became part of the national memory, recited as proof that England could stand against greater foes. His capture of Calais, held for 2 centuries, proved the endurance of his vision. Edward III's twilight was tinged with loss, of wife, of son, of empire. Yet in that twilight, the glow of his achievements did not fade completely. He left behind not only a contested inheritance, but also a mythos that shaped English identity for centuries to come. The man who rose from the shadows of Mortimer and Isabella, who turned defeat at Bannockburn into renewed ambition, who lifted his kingdom to heights unseen, closed his eyes at last as a figure both mortal and monumental. The 100 Years' War stretched far beyond his reign, but its fire had been lit by his hand, and in that fire, Edward III's memory burned bright as the warrior king, the architect of Plantagenet glory, and the sovereign whose twilight did not erase the brilliance of his dawn. The death of Edward III in 1377 did not close the story he had begun. Rather, it left behind a legacy that would echo through generations, shaping kingdoms, cultures, and identities. His reign, long and turbulent, had drawn England into the heart of continental conflict and had given birth to the 100 Years' War. The struggle he unleashed would outlast him, consuming his heirs and their rivals, and in the process, forging new definitions of kingship, nationhood, and power. Politically, Edward's reign was the seedbed of a century-long conflict that bound England and France in rivalry deeper than dynastic claim. What began as his assertion of rights through bloodline became something greater, a contest that stirred the notion of two distinct nations locked in opposition. The war demanded mobilization on a scale neither kingdom had known before. Armies were raised not only from feudal levies, but from broader musters of common men. Taxes were levied, parliaments convened, and debates about the burdens of war entered the chambers of governance. In England, this dynamic fostered the slow but unmistakable rise of Parliament. Edward's long wars required unprecedented funding, and again he summoned the Commons to grant subsidies. In return, they pressed their voice into matters of state, carving a permanent place for themselves in the machinery of governance. Thus, while the king styled himself as a warrior in shining armor, his legacy at home was the steady growth of representative power. The modern English state, with its parliament holding the purse strings, traces part of its roots to Edward's campaigns across the Channel. For France, his reign was a crucible of resilience. Though humbled and humiliated, the Valois monarchy under Charles V began to reshape its identity, learning patience and strategy where Edward had once triumphed with audacity. The rivalry crystallized two national identities, England as an island kingdom bound together in defiance, France as a continental power rebuilt through endurance. In the clash of crowns, the very concept of the nation was sharpened. Culturally, Edward's reign was the apotheosis and, in many ways, the twilight of the chivalric age. He had surrounded himself with symbols of knighthood, founding the Order of the Garter at Windsor, creating a fellowship that bound aristocracy in ideals of loyalty and valor. The tournament and the battlefield alike were stages upon which he and his sons acted out the drama of the knightly king. The image of Edward astride a horse in gleaming armor, leading his men at Crécy, or watching with measured pride as his son captured a king at Poitiers, became emblematic of the age. The longbow wielded by common archers told another story, one of innovation and the rising importance of ordinary men in shaping the fate of nations. The victories of Edward's reign demonstrated that the field of war no longer belonged solely to mounted nobility. The English archer, humble in birth but formidable in skill, became a cultural symbol as enduring as the knight. Together, knight and bowman represented the paradox of Edward's time, the celebration of ancient chivalry, alongside the dawn of new military realities. At the center of this legacy stood the Black Prince, Edward of Woodstock, whose short life burned with the brilliance of victory and whose early death added the pathos of tragedy. His dark armor, his gallantry at Poitiers, and his reputation as both conqueror and patron of chivalry cemented him as a figure of legend. He embodied the virtues his father cherished, and in death he became a myth for an England that longed for heroes. To remember Edward III was also to remember his son, the pair of them casting long shadows across the 14th century. Edward himself became a symbol of the last great age of chivalry. Later generations looked back on him as the king who revived the glories of Arthurian fellowship, who made the tournament and the battlefield one continuum of honor. Yet they also recognized that his reign marked a turning point. Beyond the splendor of feasts and jousts lay the harsh demands of taxation, the stirrings of common voice, and the inevitability of political evolution. The ideal of the Night King lived on, but the world was already moving toward something new. In the centuries that followed, the 100 Years' War carried on, shaped by Edward's legacy. It would see triumphs and disasters, Agincourt and Orléans, victories to rival Crécy, and defeats to match Calais' fall. But all of it traced back to 1337, to Edward's bold claim that the crown of France was his by right. His ambition had lit a fire that would burn for 116 years. When the last embers of that war cooled in 1453, neither Plantagenet nor Valois could claim unbroken victory. Yet the contours of modern England and France had been etched by the struggle. England, hardened and self-aware, began to see itself as an island nation apart from the continent. France, tested by invasion and occupation, emerged more unified than ever before. Thus, the legacy of Edward III was not only of battles fought and castles taken, but of nations forged. He was remembered as the warrior king, the founder of a conflict that defined two countries, and the monarch whose twilight could not erase the brilliance of his dawn. His reign closed with sorrow, but his name lived on in legend, one of the last kings of chivalry, one of the first kings of nations. And so, the story of Edward III comes to an end, not with the silence of defeat, but with the echo of a legacy that shaped centuries, a king who fought, a king who dreamed, and a king who, in both triumph and decline, changed the destiny of England and France forever.